Oprah is a gender expert with 15 years of development and practical experience in Sudan, Zimbabwe, Malawi, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Niger. And she has vast experience in integrating gender transformative approaches in food, nutrition security, and resilience programs, including supporting care country offices on gender and women empowerment. And she also has experience working with the UN Department of Peacekeeping Mission on Women, Peace and Security, and Sexual and Gender-Based Violence in Conflict. So with that, I'm really delighted to welcome our presenters for an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that really nice introduction, Mia. Delighted to be here today. And let me get the slides up. So I'm going to be presenting a review of evidence on gender and resilience that highlights the conceptual issues and uses some examples from the literature to illustrate some key concepts. Do I need to point this in a particular way for it to work? Okay, all right, here we go. Okay, so the project that I lead at IFPRI that Mia mentioned is the Gender, Climate Change, and Nutrition Integration Initiative. And one of the first things that we did for this project is to develop a conceptual framework which looks at the linkages between all of these issues. But we later realized that this would be a really useful framework to also think about more broadly gender and resilience issues. So we later adapted this to explore these dimensions of resilience and putting it in a food systems context. And so this was recently published in a chapter listed down at the bottom. And if you run into Stephen Devereaux at the conference, he can hand out a little flyer about the book and the other chapters that are available. So this framework illustrates how the well-being outcomes of shocks and stressors are really influenced by several components. And each of these components is gendered. So for example, men and women have different levels of exposure and sensitivity to shocks and stressors depending on their livelihood roles and the contexts in which they live. Similarly, men and women also have different capacities to respond to those shocks and stressors, given differential access to information, different access to services, other services like financial services, assets, other productive resources, for example. Men and women also have different preferences for how they respond to disturbances. But typically, because women have less decision-making authority, they're not able to adopt practices that maybe they prefer more. And so then the actual responses that are taken up also influence well-being outcomes, and we can have different differential well-being outcomes for men and women depending on the types of responses that people choose. The way these relationships also play out depend on characteristics of the food system, where in the food system the actors are. So for example, different food environments like rural or urban settings can also influence men's and women's level of exposure and sensitivity to shocks and stressors and the capacities that they have to respond. I'd like to mention that intersectional identities are also important. I know we have inclusion in the title of our session here. I'm going to focus mostly on gender, but it intersects with age, marital status, ethnicity, and so many other factors that are also important and matter for people's resilience. So I'm going to dive a little bit deeper into each of the components and then present a couple of examples from the literature. In terms of exposure and sensitivity, the literature shows that men and women are sometimes exposed to different types of disturbances. For example, women may be more likely to experience sexual or gender-based violence in conflict settings or in displaced populations. Men and women also experience shocks and stressors differently. So for example, if men migrate away from a climate-stressed area while women remain behind, then these women would be more exposed to the stress in that area. Sensitivity to the shocks and stressors is also gendered. So for example, gender differences in food security or nutritional status can influence men's and women's ability to withstand these shocks. And as we've seen over the last few years with COVID and now the global food crisis, the gender gap in food security is actually widening. And so you can see this difference potentially play out in terms of women having less resilience. And then again, exposure and sensitivity depend on the food system, characteristics of food systems like the food environment. Supply chain disruptions, for example, might be more severe in urban environments that depend on imported foods or foods from rural areas. And then gendered livelihood roles in food systems also matter. So which crops men and women cultivate, which types of livestock they own may be more or less sensitive to the climate shocks and stressors that they experience. And there are many different determinants of men's and women's resilience capacities. I already gave some examples in the earlier slide. In general, the literature tends to show that women have lower resilience capacities than men due to several factors. These include things like women having less access to or control over productive resources like land, which can then limit their ability to adopt certain practices like tree planting or irrigation systems. Women have more limited ability to earn and control income through employment or entrepreneurship opportunities. And this not only affects them, but the entire household, because the household then has less income to be able to cope with the shocks and stressors that they experience. And as I mentioned before, women tend to have less access to services like information, extension, or financial services, which then limits their ability to invest in climate smart practices, off-farm businesses, or other, even food for their families. And as has been mentioned many times during this conference, we all know women's work burden is already extremely high. And so women may be reluctant to take up some more practices that increase their labor burden, or sometimes they're forced to take on these practices out of need, and then it leads to an even worse work burden, which can have negative outcomes for the children's health and their own health. Food security and nutritional status are also important resilience capacities, so not just outcomes, but they really enable people to invest their labor, for example, and increase labor productivity. And women's empowerment or agency is also a really important resilience capacity in itself, which can enable women to realize their own aspirations or make choices that they would like to take in response to shocks and stressors. So I just want to zoom in on the one issue related to access to information. As I mentioned, it's a key resilience capacity, and it's really essential for people to be able to make informed decisions about how they respond to shocks and stressors, particularly climate, as the climate is changing in unexpected and unprecedented ways. But we know that women have less access to information and extension services, which can limit they don't know which practices to pick up. They don't know which ones are going to help them respond and adapt to the challenges that they face, or to expand their agricultural businesses and be able to go to markets where they know they can sell their products. A study of women's access to extension services during the COVID-19 pandemic in India and Nepal showed that women's access to extension was already very low to begin with, but was even further constrained during the pandemic. Almost 1/3 of women reported that their primary sources of extension information were unavailable or inaccessible during the periods of lockdown. And nearly 50% of women farmers in both countries reported that this had negative impacts on their agricultural productivity because of the unavailability of information. Women also noted that their primary sources of agricultural information changed sort of during the pandemic period. And as it went along, women reported that they relied more on groups and informal social networks to receive information about how to respond. So group-based approaches have emerged as a viable solution in the South Asian context and in other contexts, as other research shows, for more gender-sensitive service delivery, particularly during times of crisis. And so just to highlight this point about responses and decision-making, we know that within the same households, men and women have different preferences for how they respond to shocks and stressors, given their different livelihood activities or needs. And they both have important contributions to make to increasing resilience for their households and their communities. With women's preferences for how they respond often reflects their livelihood roles and the constraints that they face within their communities. So for example, women may be more likely to choose climate smart practices like livestock feeding or improved post-harvest processing practices that are aligned with those roles and that enable them to control more of the income that they earn through these activities and other benefits like a reduction of their time burden. But because resources are limited, women have to negotiate for their desired responses, not just in the household, but also in communities, in groups and other governing bodies. But because of women's more limited bargaining power, this has implication for the ultimate response options that are picked up, and then that has implications for the outcomes and for men and women. To illustrate this, a study in Bangladesh showed how women's decision-making can lead to different agricultural choices. So there was a study that used the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index to measure the relationship between women's agency and the allocation of farmland to different types of crops as a measure of production diversification. It shows that when women are involved in agricultural decisions and that when they participate in groups, they are more likely, the household is more likely to allocate land towards fruits and other types of crops and decrease the land allocated to cereals, which in this context is largely rice. So in this context, women's agency thus has the potential to increase climate resilience by increasing production diversity, which reduces risk. And it also has potential benefits for people's diets and their nutrition, especially if that increase in production diversification also leads to an improvement in household diets. So the choices that are made following shocks and stresses have implications for gender differentiated outcomes along several pathways. So you could think about changing production choices like diversification, which can affect the supply of foods, food access, and diets. Changes in income, and especially who controls that income, can affect expenditure patterns of the household, also with implications for people's nutrition and diets. Whose assets are built up or drawn down following a shock has implications for men's and women's future bargaining power and their resilience capacities to cope with the next shock. A lot of responses have implications for labor allocation. So some studies show, for example, that agroecological practices like conservation agriculture often increase the time burden that women spend in agriculture in many contexts. And then there are trade-offs across these outcomes as well as over time. So for example, responses that might increase food production or household incomes in the short term may have some negative implications for women's time burden, or especially if it shifts control over income to men. And to illustrate this, a study by my colleague Carlo, who's about to speak in a minute, shows how the effects of climate extremes, so namely heat waves and droughts, affects gendered labor supply in agriculture using data from labor force surveys and household expenditure surveys across many African countries. And this study shows that heat waves reduce both men's and women's labor effort in agriculture, but women's labor contribution increases relative to men's, especially under heat stress. So for women, the reduction in work intensity is 40% less compared to men. And the effects are lower in East and Southern Africa, but even higher in West Africa. One of the key reasons potentially for this finding is that men can more easily leave agriculture given better work opportunities, greater mobility compared to women. And these results highlight the important contribution of women to agricultural production on the one hand, but at the same time it raises some concerns about the increasingly harsh working conditions that women are going to be in the future under heat stress. So in terms of evidence and data gaps, we still need more evidence of the impact of interventions on gender equality and women's empowerment outcomes. I mentioned that women's empowerment is an important resilience capacity, but we also need to think about it as an important outcome, and we need to be investing in increasing women's empowerment. We also need evidence on the types of interventions and intervention approaches that facilitate women's empowerment. I know in the earlier session we talked a lot about the challenges of measuring complex programs, but I think we still need to understand what are the approaches, what are the design features, and what works to really boost women's empowerment so that we can invest in the right things. There's also scope to explore the link between social protection and adaptation and livelihood transformation and resilience over the long term and not just as a coping response. And then as we roll out interventions like gender transformative approaches that aim to really get at the root causes of vulnerability, like dealing with harmful social norms, we need more evidence of the effectiveness of these approaches, and we haven't really even started collecting that evidence yet. In general, we need more sex disaggregated data for monitoring and evaluation of impacts. I mean, we're doing better, but I think we could still do even more. And I think we could do better at sort of measuring resilience. I think we all know how complicated it is. It's coming out this entire conference, but really looking not just at capacities, but how these different dimensions of resilience relate to each other. And it's very difficult to operationalize, but I think we can move closer to that direction if we try. A useful framework for thinking about approaches that are needed to achieve gender equality goals in particular, and the indicators that we need to measure progress is the Reach, Benefit, Empower, and Transform framework. So achieving each of these goals requires different intervention approaches, which could include things like complementary activities that are added on to main program activities. So they could be things like specific trainings that are targeted to women that enable them to actually benefit from other aspects of the program. And then each of these goals also requires different indicators that are needed to measure impacts. And there are some examples in the slide here. So for example, for REACH, you might just think about what are the share of women that are participating in program activities. For benefit, you would want to look at gender differences in yields or incomes or nutritional outcomes or whatever the focus of the program would be. And for empowerment, you could look at various aspects of women's agency and how they might change as a result of an intervention. One of the tools that we use often at IFPRI is the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, which I mentioned before. And that's an intra-household survey tool, and it also has qualitative components, so it's now really a mixed methods tool. For Transform, you could look at changes in the prevalence of gender discriminatory norms and attitudes, and some colleagues are working on developing a social norms index that could then track changes in these factors over time. I would encourage governments and implementing partners to really go beyond measuring the extent to which interventions simply reach women to trying to really capture at least benefits, but better yet, let's try to capture the empowerment and the transformative outcomes as well. Especially if you're really actually aiming to transform and you're using gender transformative approaches, let's measure the impact of those interventions. But I also acknowledge at the same time that sometimes even reaching women can be very difficult. You have displaced populations. So yeah, it's a challenge, but I think we should try to go as far as we can along this spectrum here. So I don't want to spend too much time on this slide because we have a really great panel and they're going to be sort of talking about what are some of the promising interventions that they're using to really move the needle on women's empowerment and transformative outcomes through their resilience programming. Some of the things that the literature point to are, the need for more gender transformative approaches, designing services that really meet women's needs and that actually reach them and finding those channels to reach them. Group-based approaches are really critical and essential. And yeah, it's important to really make sure that we're including gender in sort of all of the stages of our project cycle. So from the theory of change and the design all the way through to monitoring and evaluation. And I will stop there and I look forward to the rest of the presentations. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, Elizabeth. That's actually a nice introduction, very brilliant introduction to what I'm gonna be talking now. First, a disclaimer. we are in a resilience evidence forum, so I'm not gonna present any evidence in terms of data. So that's weird, I know, but I think it's common to other colleagues in this forum. But I will be presenting something that is correlated to the data and to the dimensions we are talking about. And for example, one of the issues I will be talking about is using gender disaggregator for policy. And for policy, we also mean resilience programming. And that is specifically useful for the donor community. So let me deepen what I will be talking about. So I will be talking about two different studies. So one is a methodology and an application, an empirical application that we tested using global data. Especially on looking at the gender, climate, agriculture hotspot. So where these two dimensions could potentially have a higher burden on women. And then I will be talking about an empirical application. This was more of a desk study. And then I will be talking more about empirical application that we tested in 6 impact assessment for IFAD that could also be replicated in other contexts. So this is the outline. I mean, I'm not going to throw this. Don't be scared because it'll take a short time. Just to give you the structure, the data I'll be mostly talking about the data because although again we are not pretending to measure resilience here, but I will be trying to measure something that is related to resilience, especially gender disaggregated. So the background, we all know that climate change is having already impacts on food systems that also are expected to be also exacerbated in the future. Of course, it's very difficult to see these maps, but here this map shows the climate hazard in different countries by the different types, so drought, flood, etc. And you can see as whether the specific countries are impacted more than others, and specific areas of the countries are impacted more than others, depending on the specific shock. In this setting, small-scale producers, so subsistence producers, and especially our women farmers, are more vulnerable to climate shocks, given the characteristics that Elizabeth just presented earlier. So limited access to inputs, limited access to land, gender-based violence, and so forth. But to measure these inequities, usually we have limited set disaggregated data, as Elizabeth was showing before. And this study tries to go beyond this limitation and looking at and quantifying the level of risk faced by these women farmers. So the objective here is really looking at the intersection, that is risk, and is to identify subnational gender inequity, climate, agriculture hotspots. So a combination of these three elements. Because why we're going to do this? Because we would like to know where the vulnerability, exposure, and hazard brings this level of risk high, because then we would like to know where gender inequities are persistent and again could be magnified by climate change. We know that women are more vulnerable to adverse effects of climate change. We would like to know where these women are, to better targeting, especially targeting of policy intervention in resilience programming, and where the investment should be prioritized. So to do that, we rank countries. We rank 84 countries in the world. And then we selected these 4 countries, Mali, Zambia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. I will tell you in a minute how we selected these countries. But the important thing to know is that we ranked countries in developing world based on, and then we combine this country based on mostly 3 indicators. we combined the indicators using principal component analysis to reduce the dimensionality and to come up with one indicator to rank countries in the same way as the WIA does, for example, or the multidimensional poverty index does. So we use the share of adult female agricultural labor. There is a proxy of exposure of female into agriculture. The share of rural population and the climate hazard, that a measure, of course, of climate hazard. And this is actually a work that has been done by CGR colleagues. It's still in progress, so we have the first release in 2021, but we are improving on it. And then there is the third element is the gender discrimination in social institution, and we took advantage of the OECD layer 2014. So we combine this data. I mean, I understand that we have some data issues because, as you can see, not all the data have been collected in the same year. So we have some time mismatch. But this is to just to give a broad brush picture of what is going on in terms of gender inequities. Of course, we could do better once new data become available. So this is our first ranking, the country ranking, according to these indicators based on principal component analysis, so based on a combination of these three indicators here. And then cold spots are indicated by blue, so meaning that this is where areas where the gender inequities, agriculture and climate are low, while hotspot is where these indicators have high value, so high risk, so meaning higher risk for women. So this is the first 10, 15 countries, I think, ranked in a descending order along this risk value dimension. And the countries selected are Mali, Zambia, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. As you can see, they're not the first country in the list. Because we also need to balance the trade-off between having a high value of this index, so meaning being a hotspot, and data availability. That in some cases is a problem because we need to rely on micro-level data to be able to run this analysis. So we selected 2 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and 2 countries in Asia because they were both high in the ranking, and these are countries where we have data available, we have macro data available, and of course reasonably recent data. So once we select these countries, then we went deeper into looking at where in this country are the areas with a higher hotspot. So first we use a global data set at the country level. Now, once we select the 4 countries, we went deeper into looking at the subnational areas in those 4 countries. And we have, again, 3 layers. And we look at hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. And for climate hazards, we look at, so we source the global human settlement layers, 2015, with the world population, so on the population density, because of course the higher the population, the higher the risk of this population. And then the climate hazard to agriculture, present and future, and that's the layer, that's the data set I was talking about. That was released by our colleagues, our special analyst. It's essentially a reanalysis of the geospatial layers on climate hazard. And then putting this together, then we come up with a share of rural population under projected climate hazard, and we projected this value up to 2050. RCP 8.5 is a kind of a jargon to say under the business as usual emission GHG emission scenario. So under the current scenario, we come up with a share of rural population under climate hazards in these countries. And this is the map of how hazard looks like, especially explicit hazard looks like in the 4 countries. And this again will be combined with the second layer, that is a vulnerability due to gender inequity. And this again the spatial distribution of vulnerability. It's a composite index of different layers. So one is subnational gender development index. And then we have we thought to add some more dimension to, that are proxy for vulnerability. The ratio male-female between 0 and 4 years old that is commonly referred to as the missing women for a variety of reasons, for cultural reasons, social reasons. Then the third is a prevalence of lifetime physical sexual violence for ever married women. Of course, this is a proxy of gender-based violence, and this is sourced from the DHS, the Demographic and Health Service. Again, it's a microdata, available from almost all developing countries in the world at different points in time. It's funded by USAID. And the fourth is a prevalence of child marriage. That, of course, it's a particularly severe phenomenon in these countries. And it is a child marriage is among girls aged 15 to 19. So it's pretty early age. And again, this is the spatial distribution of a combination of these four layers in the 4 countries. Then finally, as a proxy of exposure, we look at the distribution of agriculture participation by crop and livestock in the 4 countries, and this data is sourced from the labor force survey again in different years, but close to 2019. And here we look at the engagement of women in 6 main groups categories that are classified in the labor force service, and the 6 main groups categories. So they're not all crops, because we also have the mixed farming. Anyway, the 6 categories are cereals, rice, vegetables, perennial, livestock, and mixed farming. And with mixed farming is crop, livestock together. As you can see here, participation is of course in rice. Cultivation is higher in Bangladesh, in other countries for obvious reasons. Mixed farming has lactose is dominant, for example, in Pakistan, it is the red bar. While in sub-Saharan Africa, we have a completely different farming system, more focused on cereals in Mali, and vegetables, Zambia, and perennial crops. So there is some, so this is to say that exposure is different because of the different farming system prevailing in those countries. So these are the preliminary results. So again, we combine these layers together. These are, I'm not going to present all 4 countries, but I will just present Mali as an example. And this is just to show that this risk is different according to the crops or the activities in which women are involved, as Elizabeth was mentioning in the conceptual framework. Because of course, different crops have different risk, and women involved in this crop have differential risk as a consequence. So these are, again, the spatial distribution of this index depending on, so it's a cross-specific index. So summary of our hotspot analysis. The first is that climate hazard shouldn't be examined in isolation, but we should be looking at different proxies of risk that is not only on climate, but also inequities and exposure. Then the second point is that we think that this is a promising approach for targeting because it takes into account both the geospatial dimension of climate, so the exogenous dimension if you want, but also social and agroeconomic characteristics and constraint. And the third point is that this analysis could really help prioritize and target gender and climate responsive policy in locations that are differently affected by climate due to the commodity-specific risk, especially again for women. Then I will come to the other piece of work that we have done. So this is a little bit different because that was a study. Here we tested our approach in 6 countries. Yes.
Sorry, Carla, we're running a little short.
Oh boy.
Time,
Okay.
So I don't know if you want to
Okay.
do a quicker summary of this.
Yes, let's do a quick summary.
Sorry.
No, that's fine. So here we try to tailor the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index at the project level. So we did it for 6 projects in IFAD. So these are all the colleagues involved in this. So we developed the streamline, let's say, shorter version of the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index. And the challenge was that we need to measure all the dimension that is in a project level WIA. And we thought that we could embed some dimensions into the standard questionnaire. So I'm not going to go through this, but essentially this is what we did. So the ProWIA, as there is a project level version of the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, has 10 dimensions in the most recent formulation, while we use 5 dimension. We include in the questionnaire the 5 dimension into the standard questionnaire to actually cut the time, the interview time. Yeah, so the issue of the proxy respondent, the difference question in wording, but we try to control for this difference in our experiment, and we show that they didn't matter that much in the end. So let me quickly. When we quickly talk about the IFAD-WIA, so this is the full circle, is the project level Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index with the 3 dimension of empowerment, collective agency, instrumental agency, and intrinsic agency. We substituted, let's say, these 5 blue dimensions here in the original ProWIA into not a specific module, questionnaire module, but into the standard questionnaire module. So that's why it uses modified questions. So each indicator is receive equal weight. The usual definition of empowerment, if the individual is adequate, is 80%, at least 80% of the indicators. And we tested this approach in 6 different projects in 6 different countries. The project ran from microfinance, value chain, business, value addition, natural resource management, and fishery project. And we got good results in the sense that, well, I'm not going to go through all the indicators we use, but we use mostly the IWIA indicators. That is the usual ProWIA indicators: empowerment score, intra-household inequality, gender parity index, the components, and then also the participation in agriculture activities. Female asset ownership, gender is aggregated again, and female food insecurity experience scale. So how is this related to resilience? Is because, of course, if people are more empowered, they're also more resilient, right? So that's the basic rationale. So the experimental design, we compared the ProWIA with IWIA, looking at whether there was an effect of the interviewer, of the respondent, the proxy respondent. And again, I'm not going to go through the results, but it looks like the Women's Empowerment Score and Household Inequality Score are mostly similar in both the ProWIA and in IWIA. But the Women's Empowerment State of Gender Parity are also higher for the ProWIA, meaning that the new method that we applied is a more conservative measure of, and these are the components that we looked at. So what I was saying is that the IFAD ProWIA provide, let's say, less precise, more conservative measure of the women's empowerment compared to the ProWIA. But the important thing is that the IFAD IWIA requires approximately 50% fewer questions than the original ProWIA. So with the subsequent time saving and financial also saving, if you want to feel that this instrument. And differences between the ProWIA and IWIA are primarily driven by ownership of land and other assets. So the recommendation is to implement, let's say, the new integrated Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, but using the ProWIA asset module to overcome the issue of underestimate of ownership of land and other assets. Because this could be important for intervention aimed at improving female asset ownership. Let me end here. And then we'll have the next presenter. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks so much for that presentation. So I want to move on with my presentation that really focuses on gender transformative pathways to resilience and evidence from food and livelihood security programs that we are implementing globally as CARE and also with our partners. So just to set the stage there, in terms of the focus on gender and resilience, we are looking at the current triple global crisis around economic, food, and climate, and they put resilience as a critical focus of development and humanitarian program. And we are also looking at men and women experiencing crisis differently. I think my colleagues have already mentioned that women and men are impacted differently by shocks and stressors, social and cultural norms that are linked to barriers to resilience, and also the need to understand and approach resilience across scales. And I'm going to have a discussion around this, looking at individual level, at household level, community, and systems level. There's also sectoral agreement that addressing gender equality builds household, community, and system resilience. Though we do have weak evidence around this, but we are trying to build evidence around that. And also programming continues to have gender blind spots. We have noted for most of our programs in food and water systems, they do have gender blind spots which really impact on resilience outcomes. So I wanted to kind of start by defining what gender transformation is, knowing that GTA's gender transformative approaches really play an important role in building and driving resilience. So when we are talking of gender transformation, we are moving beyond individual empowerment. We normally talk of women empowerment, but for gender transformation, we are really moving beyond that, building agency, but to start to critically challenge and question the discriminatory gender social norms, looking at the policies and legislation, the extent to which they push for gender equality. So really, gender transformation is about engaging people of all genders at different levels and in a synchronized way. And for us, gender synchronization is really key when we are looking at only focusing on women's empowerment, but also engaging men and boys and working with other influential groups. And when we look at this model, this is kind of the way that we are pushing for GTAs within our food and water systems programs, starting by conscientization, be it of men and women, so kind of building their agency, their skills and capabilities, but moving to intimate dialogues at different levels, at household levels, and also building the best for them to create peers and engage broadly with the communities and stepping up eventually for advocacy. So when we are talking of gender transformation, we really want to go beyond building, women's agency, but also to start to engage with the different influential groups at community level and have this kind of dialogues and influencing in the different spaces. Yeah, so I think we are on the same page in terms of understanding, the different resilience capacities, as these are really key and important around building, resilience, the anticipatory capacity, and this we are looking at the ability to anticipate the likelihood of shocks and stressors and therefore reduce their impact, absorptive capacity, ability to cope with shocks, using the different skills and resources, and of course the adaptive capacities involves, using informed decision making in anticipation, of or in response to any changes, and definitely transformative capacities where we really want to go, looking at structural and systematic changes that enable the other capacities to, to work out. So basically, when we are talking of GTAs, we really want to see the extent to which gender transformative approaches are really driving and pushing towards the achievement of the different, resilience capacities, and like I've mentioned, at different scales. So I want to kind of share some preliminary results that are coming from a study that CARE participated in with some partners through the Southern Africa Resilience Academy. So I'm just going to call it the SARA research. So CARE is part of this gender working group, working with other members, including Concern, FANAPLAN, ICRAF, Rural Women's Assembly, and they've conducted this research mainly focusing on literature synthesis in different countries, 6 country programs, and they also conducted in-depth interviews interacting with men and women from these different countries. And those are the research questions that they kind of were looking at. What are we learning from the different gender transformative approaches programs? So what is it that we are really getting out of these programs that are able to integrate GTAs? And also, what does gender transformation and resilience mean for and to the people? I think you remember, colleagues, from the first day where we had a conversation around what does resilience mean. And in this case, it's also important as practitioners, we might have a common understanding of resilience, but we also want to learn and to understand from a community level perspective. What does it really take? And what does it look like if households are saying they are resilient or communities are resilient? And the third one there, how we impact and sustain resilience across scales, which is really important. So I think this is just to share some of the barriers, the gender barriers to resilience for small-scale farmers, and we do have direct quotations from some of the community members in terms of the barriers that are prevalent within the communities at household level and at community level. So women really walking long distances to access markets, which is really a challenge that we are noting. I've talked about the discriminatory and harmful gender norms at community level. Women are not, they don't have equitable decision making, the challenges of gender division of labor, and also lack of resources for women. They have limited resources. The cost of farming inputs is really a constraint for women to actually access inputs, access to fertilizer. So we do have quite a long list of gender barriers or gender-related constraints that really impact on resilience. Okay. Yeah, I still want to also kind of explain so that we have a better understanding when I'm talking of gender transformative approaches. What do they really mean? And what does it mean when we are saying we should implement an integrated kind of approach when it comes to GTAs? And here I want to refer to the CARE Gender Equality Framework. It really helps to guide the way we implement GTAs within our programs to make sure that they are holistic and integrated in nature. And here I'm talking about building agency, women's capabilities and skills, their confidence skills, self-esteem, and aspirations, which is really key when we are talking of women's empowerment. But when we are talking also about gender transformation, we really want to go beyond building women's agency and capabilities and to start to question the relationships at household level, to challenge unequal power dynamics at household level. And in this way, we have interventions that will include engaging men and boys as supporters and champions of gender equality, you know, to improve on relations and have equitable relationships. And it also involves dialogues at household and community level. So agency, really important, challenging unequal relationships, but also transforming systems and structures. So we want to make sure that we challenge harmful social norms, we facilitate, you know, systems level change, we look at policies and frameworks and to see the extent to which they promote gender equality. So basically when we are talking of GTAs, they should be comprehensive and address or hit all these three components of the gender equality framework, ensuring that you're building women's agency and capabilities, aspirations, but making sure that you also have interventions that really promote equitable relationships and go beyond to really look at the systems and structures. So these are the preliminary results that we are kind of getting from this SARA research that has been done by CARE and partners to try and reflect on how the different GTAs. So you will see that we do have our GTA approaches here. Yeah, the different GTAs and how they then contribute to gender equality outcomes. So the most exciting bit around the GTAs is, remember when we are talking of gender transformative approaches, we are looking at them being holistic and at multiple scales. So it means we do have various GTAs that are hitting gender changes at individual levels. We also want to look at GTAs that really improve on household relations, GTAs that are impacting at community level and systems level. So within our food and water systems programming, when we are talking of gender transformative approaches, we also need to be very deliberate, looking at agency relations and structure. Not only that, but across the scales. What are those GTAs that will make you see the changes that you want to see at individual level? What are the changes that you want to see at household level, at community level, and at systems level? So based on this, there are some indications from the programs looking at this research contributing to the different gender equality outcomes. I think my colleague or someone has already indicated that we really want to monitor and to see how the different gender transformative approaches result in gender equality outcomes, and eventually how these also contribute to our resilience outcomes. And the gender equality outcomes also across scales, at individual level, at household level, community, and systems level. So basically what we are saying from, and what we are seeing from this study is really the GTAs are pushing towards achievement and realization of the different gender equality outcomes across scales, but also contributing to resilience outcomes here, the different capacities that I've talked about already, and eventually the food security, livelihoods, and and climate resilience outcomes. So this is more like, in brief, what we are kind of seeing from this study, that indeed GTAs are critical when implemented holistically and when they are integrated across scale to really push for the changes that we want to see in terms of achieving resilience outcomes. Yeah, I'm told I'm left with 2 minutes. But I think this is my important slide. Thank you. So, yeah, these are simply the pathways, the gender transformative pathways to resilience. And I really like this graphic. In other words, it's simply really showing you what I've been talking about in terms of your gender transformative approaches at different scales. So we have our ECATA dialogues, we have our social analysis and action dialogues that we implement at different scales. We have our village savings and lending, approaches that we implement to push for changes in behaviors at individual level, at household, community, and systems, and also really looking at the gender equality framework that I was talking about for us to make sure that we are comprehensive. We are addressing agency-related issues. We are addressing, unequal power dynamics. We are challenging the discriminatory gender social norms. We are looking at the policies and the systems and pushing the resilience capacities that we want to see. And eventually at the core, these are the outcomes around food and water systems, livelihoods, and climate justice. Yeah, so this is a case study. The good thing is I've actually put a link so you can access to get more detail in terms of one of the projects from Burundi that implemented a gender transformative approach and the results that they were able to see is from implementing or integrating a holistic and comprehensive GTA within their program. So you can get more detail by accessing the link. And lastly, probably, just to sum it up, the levers and barriers to GTA integrated programs. What are those levers as we move forward, or the barriers that we should be aware of in terms of ensuring effectiveness of GTAs on resilience? So lack of desire to participate, learn, and apply GTAs. And we have also noted that for most of the programming, GTAs are kind of isolated to household level intervention. So you will see for most of our programs that we tend to focus on household level change, yet we do have an opportunity to really be comprehensive with the GTAs to make sure that we embed and we integrate those that also look at individual level, at systems level, and at community level. And I think these are the levers around GTA for resilience, looking at women's empowerment. My colleagues have already mentioned that. It's really important to look at women's empowerment, but go a step further to really challenge the discriminatory norms. Engaging community leaders, ensuring gender inclusive trainings, and all that. So lastly, as we look into the future, I think GTA is a critical approach to strengthening resilience capacities across scales, as I was sharing. It's also important to invest in strengthening evidence on link between GTA and the resilience capacity. So this is something that we are moving towards and starting to do to really see the link between these GTAs and resilience capacity. So there's need to continue to get that evidence around that. Gender equitable systems are really critical to building resilience, and programs will make more steady progress by addressing systems level factors. So at systems level, it's also important to focus on that if we are to build resilience. And better integration of climate adaptation and change into gender and resilience programming is really needed, given the importance of ecosystem restoration and resilience. Thank you. I think this is my last slide. Thank you.
Okay, let's just give one last round of applause to our amazing presenters. Thank you, Oprah, Carlo, and Elizabeth. And what a rich set of both information, data, lessons learned. I wanted to open it up just really quickly. If there's one or two questions that people might have, I don't think we'll spend a long time. We're going to move quickly to the next piece of the session, but just wanting to ask either online or in person if anyone had a question or a clarification they wanted to ask any of our presenters? Yes?
And maybe that's for Oprah. So I'm Delphine, I'm working for the working program. And thanks for the presentation. Oh, thanks. I think we have very similar findings and activities, and it's amazing to see how we all come to the same conclusions. But my question is more at the systems level, and it's really because I really don't know, and I really see that CARE is working so much at the community, household level. In terms of influencing the norms, apart from working at the community and household level, is CARE involved as well in really trying to influence at the policy level also in the countries where you work?
Thank you so much for that question. And you are right that we do have a lot of programs running in the different countries. And also we have a lot of engagement at community level, but also just to mention that our GTAs, the gender transformative approaches that we are implementing do cover and allow for policy level engagement, policy level advocacy, and recently in our program, especially in Ethiopia, they've been doing a great job to also engage with government around, integrating GTAs into government systems, strategies, gender strategies, and building their capacity around gender transformation. So we do have that space to actually address the systems level and the policy level through the different GTAs. So we have done some kind of mapping to say what kind of GTAs can we use at individual level that can really push for the agency-related changes we want to see. Which type of GTAs can we use at community level, which I know we are mostly there, but also how can we leverage, how can we use the different GTAs at policy level for advocacy, for influencing, and for change. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Genevieve from Environmental Incentives. I have a question for you, Elizabeth. You mentioned that conservation and agriculture interventions often have an increased time burden for women. And I'm just wondering if that was like an initial phase as they're transitioning from conventional to conservation, or if that was over several growing seasons, enough time to see that maybe that was mitigated, or if you had other insights about how you could mitigate that result if it is a consistent result.
Yeah, I think conservation agriculture is one of the few sort of climate smart practices that we have actually seen some reviews on, and there are several studies that note this change or the increase in women's labor burden with the introduction of conservation agriculture. I don't know across all of those studies at what level in time they're actually measuring the women's time burden after these practices are introduced. But I think that there's, with a lot of these things in mulching, composting, manure management, women often take on a lot of these kinds of tasks. And so one of the things that we were concerned about too with the global food crisis and the lack of chemical inputs is that, again, if we introduce a lot of these practices, it could lead to an increase in women's time burden. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do them, but I think it's something that we need to consider as a factor and a potential trade-off. And then can we actually think about ways of mitigating that, sharing the labor? Maybe men can help out more at home. I mean, those are the kinds of things that we can think about going forward. Thanks.
Oh, one quick question, yes?
Hi everyone, I'm Mumbi with the Global Resilience Partnership. I have a question for any of the speakers. It's a bit general, but I was wondering, with your strategies, how do you include women in indigenous communities and how do you approach that, especially with the data collection?
Who would like to take that question briefly?
Maybe I'll just say a word about data collection. I mean, I know IFPRI and I think other research organizations tend to hire local survey firms or local partners to collect data, and we always do ask that they have the expertise to be able to implement that survey or qualitative research or whatever it may be in those communities, and they usually hire people who are from those communities to carry out the research. So we try to make sure that the partners that we work with to gather data have that sensitivity to work in the communities that we're asking them to work in. I don't know if, Carlo, you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, now for data collection, that's a very good point. So we usually collect data in an experimental setting where we have, let's say, treated households and control households. And we usually don't get to select who gets the project, who doesn't get the project. And it's true that probably most of the time we neglect indigenous communities because our implementers do. And we need to, and we usually come afterwards, an ex post, and then we select control households and villages as similar as possible to treated. So if there are no indigenous communities in the treated households, then we don't select indigenous communities in the control households. But now, for a project that is coming up in Colombia, for example, we are explicitly targeting indigenous communities for this project. It's a project that Elizabeth also mentioned, Nature Positive Solutions. And as a counterfactual, we will also select indigenous communities. And of course, we will note that into our institutional review board application, because whenever we collect data, we need to have authorization and also from the local. Not only from our institution, but also from local institution review board, and we need to ask permission to these communities to collect data.
Great, thanks. So I think we're going to wrap up this portion of the session, but you've heard a lot from the presenters, so we're going to have a little interactive session. So I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Asli.
Thank you, Mia. Yes, we wanted to break the sort of the one-sided conversation and also hear from our sort of participants online. We have just a few quick sort of quiz, cloud source ideas for us to react. And Alvis is helping us put the questions up very quickly. All right, the first one, and this is really, again, picking up on a lot of the conversations from the last couple of days, and we talked about, response and some of the ways we were able to track some of the gendered impacts of COVID-19. And one wonders, what % of policy measures taken in response to COVID-19 are or were gender sensitive? I think we pulled this data point some time ago, but it is indicative of where the pattern sort of was going towards. So is it 70%, 50%, 30%, or 10%? Please go to the menti.com site, and the code is there. For those who can't read, it's 76194518. Right, let's just give a minute. Okay. Love to see numbers going up. Here you go. We are certainly on the ballpark in that it is lower than maybe what we want to see. All right. Because we don't have a lot of time and we really want to hear from our panel, I'll just say that the number was actually 30%, 32% to be exact. And this was tracked by the UN, UNDP, and they looked at about like 5,000 policy measures that were put in place sort of soon after COVID, and only about 1,600 had either taken into account the specific risks to women and girls or had like built in some specific sort of targeting measures within their programs. And also to note that more than 50% of that 30% was focused on gender-based violence, while as both Elizabeth's sort of phone surveys that she mentioned, as well as we heard this morning in one of the sessions, women also had much deeper sort of livelihood impacts, and due to their specific occupational areas, as well as due to care burden. So there was a bit of a mismatch there, but still seeing like what areas they focus were of interest. Can we move to the next question, please, very quickly? And this also goes, and I have to say, Rohan had a cartoon this morning showing to sort of maybe the idea of dropping some human rights onto the sort of the disaster areas as well. How about this question? Nearly blank women of working age around the world live in countries that do not grant them the same rights as men. And the options are 2.4 billion, 2.4 million, 1.3 billion, and 2.4 billion. All right. It's coming in faster this time. And again, we're close to what it is actually, and it is 2.4 billion. So this is based on the Women, Business and the Law report that the World Bank puts every couple of years. And again, if we think about systems and structures and really affecting change, rights are fundamental. It's, in so many ways, from right to representation, to access to finance, to access to land. There's very critical aspects of resilience and adaptive capacity really comes with having the same rights and protections also within legal systems. So just wanted to flag those two. All right, and then we had one more, but maybe that's for later. So I'll pass it back to Mia because we have a very interesting conversation coming as well.
Okay, great. Thanks. May we, whoops, I think we're going to skip this one. So we're going to, whoops. How do I turn this off? Oh, may you please turn it off? I think we're going to invite our panelists, and I'm going to invite you to come a little bit more in the center. We promised to turn off the screen so you're not feeling so blinded. Okay, great, thanks. So sorry, I guess you do need to stay off to the side. So for the second part of the session, I'm really happy to welcome our panelists who will bring their perspectives and learning from the field as experts and practitioners who work very closely with both men and women in communities to support them to become more resilient and to be agents of change. So thank you for that. So first we will hear from Anu. So Anu Fashola. Anu is a gender equality and social inclusion advisor for the USAID-funded Feed the Future Nigeria Rural Resilience Activity. So this is being implemented by Mercy Corps with partners. And she leads the development of strategies which identify, prioritize, and mitigate the unique challenges different social identities face in market systems and resilience building programs. So she helps teams implement evidence-driven approaches that challenge inequality and exclusion to promote the resilience of marginalized people despite ongoing shocks in Northeast Nigeria. So also on our panel, we have Jackie Manisabwe. Jackie is a social protection specialist at the World Bank, where she joined in 2018. So with 15 years of professional experience, she's been working with nonprofit organizations, the private sector, and bilateral organizations on several topics such as women's economic inclusion, youth employment, and refugees and internally displaced, among many other topics I'm sure that you're working on. So she currently co-leads the social protection operations in Burundi and recently conducted a gender assessment that explored the determinants of women's economic empowerment. And then we also have Delphine Deschaux, who is joining. Delphine is the Chief of Resilience and Livelihoods Unit at the World Food Program. She joined WFP 20 years ago, following several years with ACF and the Red Cross in Cambodia, Albania, Kosovo, Burundi, and Sierra Leone. So with WFP, she's worked as a program officer and then head of program in various countries such as Mozambique, Ethiopia, Sudan, Somalia, and joined headquarters in her current position last year in September. So her unit currently oversees WFP's integrated resilience portfolio, as well as the technical areas of assets and ecosystem restoration, livelihoods, and skill development. So, wow, we have an incredible panel, so get ready. My first question goes out to all of you in order of introductions. So what approaches is your organization using to reduce gender inequality and facilitate women's empowerment through your resilience programs. So you each have 5 minutes. So I don't know, can I turn to Anu first? Or we can also, since you just joined.
Yes, I've been online.
Yes, we can hear you. Are you able to hear us?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. Thank you very much, and I'm really happy to join you all. So on rural resilience activity is a USAID $49 million investment in Northeast Nigeria. The activity deploys market systems development approach, trying to revive the economy of Northeast Nigeria that has been greatly impacted by a long history of shocks around conflict. And then with the onslaught of COVID-19, this exacerbated the shocks that has impacted food systems negatively and also impacted the most vulnerable groups, which include women and young people. Now, with the onslaught of COVID, the activity launched a rapid market assessment to try to understand the impact of the pandemic on women. Women constitute 60% of the agricultural workforce in Northeast Nigeria. And we also find that women and young people function a great deal in micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises. And the assessment showed that this group of people had been impacted. Their businesses had suffered a great deal from the impact of COVID-19. The assessment then recommended that it was important to have like a cash assistance to be able to cushion the shocks of COVID-19. Now, USAID was very kind and they invested $10 million for cash assistance to COVID-19. Now, the activity then thought that it's important that since we're bundling cash assistance with a market systems development program, it was important to deploy an approach that would lead to sustainable economic empowerment for these marginalized groups. So the activity launched a partnership with commercial banks instead of doing cash disbursement or having cash vouchers distributed to women and young people. Now, in these partnerships, the incentive for the private sector partners, who are the commercial banks, was the fact that they were going to open accounts for the women and young people whose businesses had been affected. And the cash available to activate the account was an incentive for them to deploy their agents to the communities. Now, that helps to bridge the gap and remove those restrictions that prevent women from accessing financial services. At the end of the day, with this approach, we were able to reach over 5,000 individuals. 30,000 out of these were women, 23,000 were men, and 35% of these numbers were young people. Now, out of all of these, over 47,500 were farmers, and then the rest were micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises. Now, we're able to achieve this because of our partnership with the commercial banks. And at the end of the day, it had long-term impact, whereby these marginalized groups were able to then continue to access more financial services, such as loans, such as insurance, because the accounts opened for them were activated using the cash disbursement. Now, another beautiful outcome from this bundled approach was the fact that people who ordinarily would not access financial services were able to access financial services from these banks who had moved to the communities. Now, it was also a win-win approach because the banks now had their services scaling up and expanding to communities and to locations where they ordinarily would not operate. So their customer base had expanded. And then the farmers were also able to continually stay active in the market. We had a lot of business expansion, business diversification. We had female farmers now being able to invest in procuring, processing machines through their collectives. We had, a lot of opportunities opening up as a result of this bundled approach, which had to do with integrating the cash assistance using a market systems development approach. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jackie.
Yeah, thank you so much. I want to be talking about how social protection is used to respond to resilience and build women empowerment. So first, the reason of empowering women is on twofold. First, women, represent the highest share of the population, more than 50%. But at the same time, they represent the high proportion of poor. In Burundi, for example, we have women-headed households, around the 50% are poor, against the 28% of men only. And the women are disproportionately affected by global development challenges, looking at informality, being out of school, economic shocks, low access to financial opportunities, and so on. And the second rationale is that investing in women has a multiplier effect to ensure that, up to 90% are reinvested back in their children, their households globally. So let me talk at how social protection is well positioned to respond to those challenges. For example, in Burundi, the programmatic approach is flexible and depends on the country context and the need. But we do have 4 pillars that are likely to be found in many SPJ operations around the world. In Burundi, we have a 150 million budget to cover 10 million people. I'm talking about individuals. And the many pillars are first the cash transfer. Cash transfer, in some contexts, it may be conditional or unconditional in the forms of cash or in kind or other e-vouchers. And the reason of giving cash is to build immediate resilience, to make families, more power to access food services and other basic needs such as health, education, and so on. And the other pillars is the cash plus interventions. Cash interventions have 2 objectives. The first is to engage men also to be part of the agenda so that they can jointly plan with their women or their spouses on how to allocate the budget. It also helps to avoid unintended consequences. What are the perceptions about women receiving cash in households, especially social norms, especially, to avoid the backlash and, promote the joint decision making. The third pillar is about the productive inclusion, to build resilience, to offer also opportunities of livelihood, saving, asset, and the off-farm activities. The 4th one is about systems. This has been very important in the time of shocks, especially during COVID, to identify where needs are, but also to coordinate and to be able to scale up interventions rapidly when the pandemic happened. And these are supported by technologies. For example, all our beneficiaries are receiving mobile phones, and this helped to communicate with them, to provide cash. They're receiving electronic cash transfers, but also to monitor how progress is coming. There are many that are channeled through the phone survey, but also we use that for grievance redress mechanisms. Beneficiaries have the opportunity to file compliant using phone and also receiving feedback on the outcome. And the impact so far is coming, on many aspects. For example, social protection is helping to build human capital development. More households are accessing better health, mothers, children. For example, in our programs, we have seen that all beneficiaries have purchased medical car insurance so that they can access health services. We can see also that all children are getting to school and they do not drop. And this is one of the pathways to access better jobs in the future. Second, social protection is also helping to integrate refugees in social protection systems. We are actually trying to avoid, the reliance on humanitarian aids, but helping refugees to access economic opportunities and durable solutions. The third one, in terms of positive result, is how SGBV is helping to address GBV. This, I talked about the cash transfer information, training, sensitization that involve men. So this help, to strengthen the bargaining power in households, but also at community level. And importantly, during the time of shock, this is the fourth layer of impact, is how households are getting like diversification in terms of livelihood, savings, of farm activities, etc., so that they can build long-term resilience. So let me stop there. But I do think, that it's really promising to invest in social protection.
No, thank you. Delphine?
Thanks very much. Good afternoon. So just to give a bit of context, so WFP works in about 120 countries and covers, last year was 160 million people, a lot through emergency, but approximately 20% of what we do is resilience building. And also the divide between the two is a bit artificial, because in the places where we work, it's very concomitant. And while we are saving lives, we are changing life at the same time. But we've heard so much about, over the last 2 days, how women and girls are more affected by food insecurity and how they are less resilient. And about 60% of the world's most food insecure people are women and girls. So we've, WFP, knowing that, has been really trying to mainstream gender considerations for a long time. So we've had a policy, I think, on gender since the early 2000s. And there is a new one which was issued last year again. So it's, I don't know, maybe number 5 or 6 policy. And currently, the policy has 3 main objectives. The first one is to achieve equitable access to and control over food security and nutrition. Second is to address the root causes of gender inequality that affect food security and nutrition. And the third is advance economic empowerment of women and girls for food security and nutrition. But it's all very context specific. So it's not like we have one program which we deploy everywhere, because in every country where we work, we really try to understand the gender barriers that affect women, girls, men, and boys for food security and nutrition. Not necessarily that we are the ones doing the analysis ourselves. Actually, we often rely on partners like CARE, who is one of our partners on these issues, or IFPRI, of other research that exists. And then based on that, we try to design the programs. What we see is really a lot of the things which have been mentioned by everybody, is that women tend to be really, thank you, burdened by chores and household chores, much more than men. Financial inclusion is a problem in most countries. Access to education, access to land and other assets, less diversified livelihoods, access to credit, the psychological resilience as well is problematic in a lot of countries. So we really try to target, to design our programs based on that. So for instance, we are going to be working on asset rehabilitation for women, bringing the water points closer to them, giving them better access to markets. We normally really start from a community-based approach. So we talk to them and we understand what are their problems, and we are trying to help them. So, for instance, even in Somalia, where we are working with the government on the safety net national programs, all the transfers are, the women are recipients of 100 of those transfers. And this safety net has been also the opportunity to create mobile bank accounts for them to facilitate digital inclusion. Or in the Sahel, where we have a big integrated programs. So we target women, farmers, we help them with land leasing and et cetera, et cetera. So all of those programs, or education as well. We have a big school feeding program across the world, and we specifically, we target all kids, but when there is really an imbalance between boys and girls, we try to encourage the enrollment of girls in the schools. But I think what we really see overall is that it works much better when the programs are multi-sectorial. So we don't do one intervention, but several at different level as well, as was mentioned by Hopper. So individual, household. At the systems level, maybe we do not work that much on gender, but we partner with UN Women or other organizations. And again, for us, the partnerships are really important for implementation because WFP generally does not implement directly, but we rely on partners. So we work with NGOs. So it's really the capacity of those NGOs, which is a big determinant as well of the quality of the programs.
Great, thanks. I have a second quick question, and I'm going to start again with you, Anu, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists maybe to only spend 3 or 4 minutes, not 5 minutes, so we can have some time at the end in case others in the audience want to ask a couple of questions. But how do you build evidence and learning from your programming approaches, and really which approaches effectively increase resilience and reduce gender inequality? I know a very simple question, but Anu, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'd like to start by saying that building a very, very strong GESI learning and adaptation agenda into any program is critical for achieving resilience. So on Feed the Future Nigeria Rural Resilience Activity, which is being implemented by Mexico, Nigeria and its partners, we mobilize a lot of partnerships. We mobilize private sector partners, social enterprises, civil society organizations into the Northeast Nigerian region to be able to revive the markets that had suffered from a lot of recurrent shocks. Now, when we mobilize these partnerships, we launch a lot of inclusive business models that are expected to help the marginalized groups to gain new entrants or become strengthened in their participation in the market. But at some point, we consider it very important to pause and to test the viability of these business models. So we actually conduct assessments to test the viability of the business model that these partners are launching to see if it is actually yielding results in terms of creating access to productive resources for women, for young people, for those who are persons with disabilities, for the internally displaced persons, because Northeast Nigeria has a variety of populations with different levels of vulnerability. Now, when we launched the first assessment, we discovered that some of the business models were building a lot of capacity, but this was not exactly translating to economic empowerment, as some key performance indicators like access to income, jobs, we were not seeing savings, we were not seeing investments or business development for these marginalized groups. So when we did this assessment, on the other hand, we also discovered that some of the business models were yielding the results that we wanted around women and youth economic empowerment. We discovered that the commercial agents model was one thing that was working. Now, what we did at that point was to, pause and see, are there ways we can improve on some of these partnerships that are only building capacity? And then on the other hand, are there ways that we can now expand these models that are showing results around women and youth economic empowerment? So we discovered the commercial agents model. This is a model that allows for business entities that have products and services to empower people as sales agents. So they identified these women. We were able to pioneer this with Solar Sisters. Solar Sisters are into clean energy products. So they identify women, loan them products, empower them to understand their products, to sell, and then build their capacity to be able to save and grow their businesses. And we discovered that this worked well. This worked well. We gathered our evidence and organized a roundtable session where we invited other private sector partners who have products and services, private sector partners into impute dealership, private sector partners with fast-moving consumer goods, with financial services. And then we shared our findings with them. We told them how this works. Using Solar Sisters evidence, we were able to show how this can yield to return on investment for their businesses. Now, one thing that stood out strongly for us at that time was that the USAID mission in Nigeria had introduced us to Unilever. Unilever is a high-profile private sector organization that has a lot of body care, nutrition, and food, healthy products for households. And we were able to use this data to speak with Unilever. Unilever does Shakti in other regions in Nigeria, except Northeast Nigeria. Using this data, we're able to convince them that there's a market here. Despite the shocks, the women and young people are a viable market segment that are worthy of investment. We use this data to speak to Unilever, and out of all the partners that USAID had introduced, our data was able to convince Unilever to pioneer with just 50 women. They were like, oh, we're only going to pilot with 50 women, and we're not even sure that women are going to, give us the return on investment. They tried with 50 women. And at the end of the evaluation, at the end of the pilot phase, we did a post-evaluation where we found that the women that were loaned the products from Unilever were able to pay off their loans. Not just pay off their loans, they reached over 50 women reached over 7,000 households with nutrition and body care products by Unilever. We also found that these women had bills and were maintaining their income because Unilever had introduced them to their supply chain, and they were getting products after paying off the loans that they were given. Now, after that, when we had the post-evaluation, we now use the data to meet with Unilever again and say, let's talk. Now you have tried with 50 women. What do we do? And Unilever now said, now we're ready to try with 2,500 women in 4 states. Now, this for us was the best example, as to what evidence can do when it comes to reducing inequalities. As a matter of fact, data is helping us on rural resilience activity to be incremental in our JESI approaches. Evidence that we gather helps us to identify the right partnerships, help us to know which business models to scale up. And this is just the power of evidence for gender equality and social inclusion. Thank you very much.
Thanks. I love that example. What a great example and what great enthusiasm. Jackie, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I want to be talking about the 4 tools that we're using it to generate evidence and learn from our resiliency programming. So the first tool is the country policy and institutional assessment, the CPIA tool, which has several indicators, but a section on our gender indicators. And these indicators are assessing, how the country promotes equal access for men and the women to human capital, to productive asset, and how the country strengthens agency for change and the equalization of status between men and the women. The good news with that tool is that Burundi is at the 4 out of 5. This is the score. Which means that we continue the policy dialogue to close that gap. The second tool is the women business and the law. This is the tool that Ashley was talking about. It measures laws and regulations that affect women economic opportunities. We have 8 indicators going around the mobility, which means the capacity for women to get, for example, a passport or to travel without asking authorization from the husband. We have also indicators around the working conditions, pay, parenthood, when a woman, for example, wants to go to maternity leave. Indicators around the marriage, entrepreneurship, access to assets, for example, the land. Or the pensions. If women, when they interrupt the careers for family reasons, they get the same pensions as men. The bad news with that is that, the global score is 77%. Only 14 countries have so far closed the gender legal gap. And looking at the progress, it would take around 50 years to close the gender legal gap if the pace, remains the same as it has in the last couple of years. That's a bad news. And another bad news is that, this is only based on the existence of law. It doesn't look at how the law is enforced. And then we do understand the gap is even wide if you look at those aspects of enforcement. The third tool is the empowerment framework based on 4 E's. The 4 E's are empowerment, enhancement. Enhancement look at the aspect of access to reproductive health. There are the education, but we look at the completed secondary education, and the employment, which look at the qualitative access to better jobs in terms of wage also. So with that, this is more operational, and we conducted a deep dive at the World Bank last year as part of the gender assessment that we talked about. And the good news was that all the portfolio was using at least 1 E in their operation to ensure that women are empowered in their operations. Last tool is the advisory services and analytics. This is, the way we are using it to inform the design and to support the implementation of our program, to generate knowledge, to build the capacity, to document best practices, and pass to the dissemination of evidences. And this is a really powerful tool to strengthen policy dialogue, because it can either finance interventions from the government side or from partners, but also on the internal side at the World Bank. So we have many tools. I only wanted to talk about those 4 aspects, but happy to discuss a little bit more if you're all interested.
Great, thanks Jackie for sharing the 4 tools, the good, the bad, and the 4 E's. Delphine, over to you.
Thanks. So I will try to be quick. So at WFP, we normally measure, we have a mixed approach to measurement and evidence. So we do a lot of monitoring, so collecting a lot of data. I think we have maybe 1,000 indicators, which are supposed to all be segregated by gender and age. But we measure generally everything which is around food security and nutrition. So our indicators will be about food consumption score, or, how it is for women versus men, or the nutrition as well indicators, or the coping strategies, how men and women adjust their cope differently during crisis, or things like how the decision is made within the household, if it's by both of them, or the man or the women. And of course, equity is always considered better. But actually, all those indicators, and we have so many of them, do not necessarily tell us the story so well. So for us, what we see is that we really need a lot more to do qualitative as well, and which we are doing increasingly. So really discussing with these women and these men and these communities to understand, because sometimes even these indicators seem a bit contradictory when we look at them. So to unpack all of that, we really focus a lot on the qualitative ourselves, but also through partners, research partners. So IFPRI is actually one of our big research partners, but we have many others. To really come in a country or two and really unpack all of that. And recently, IFPRI did with us a social cohesion study of the resilience program in the Sahel, which looked at how these integrated resilience interventions are improving social cohesion and actually empowering women, because of the participatory and community-based discussion and approaches which have really facilitated the dialogue at the community level. So that was really key for women empowerment. So that's a bit the how. So in terms of the main findings, I think, a lot of have been mentioned. So in terms of the constraints that are faced by women, I think we can mention also that women also have some assets that men don't have, like the social cohesion, for instance. What we saw from all of our monitoring is that the network of social support that women had is much stronger. So they can really rely on each other much more, and even sometimes even to babysit the kids or things like that. And it's really an important source of resilience for them as well. And other findings is, as mentioned earlier, so, trying to intervene at different levels with different type of interventions, but always context specific. To work a lot with men as well, of course. It's key. Like, I wouldn't be here if my husband was not at home with the 3 kids. And I'm sure it's the same for a lot of the women here. And with the elders in the village, etc. And also that it takes time, that it's not done overnight. And even in some of our countries, like it started 120 years ago. And we are there now, but it's not, transformation is not done overnight.
Thank you. Really good points. I just wanted to open it up really quickly to see if there were any questions or comments that folks had before we wrap up the session. Please.
Thank you so much. My name is Sindreda Ndlovu. I'm from Zimbabwe. I wanted to find out from the work that the different speakers are doing if there is progression in terms of the access to financial services for women, like your loans from your financial institutions, because I understand that a lot of the women, especially in agriculture, are not eligible for those loans. So from the years that you've been in this kind of work, have you seen any progression? Is there any improvement, and what can we do to bring the financial institutions on board to make eligibility more inclusive of women and the circumstances surrounding the fact that, as you already rightfully mentioned, of how they don't have collateral that the banks demand, and all the eligibility criteria that may be out of reach for a lot of women.
Quickly, also from WFP, we don't do loans. However, we work with smallholder farmers, and actually we buy from them. Something that we've been really trying to do more and more over the past years is work as well with women farmers. And I know that when WFP provides a contract, an advance contract for the purchase of the next harvest, in some countries, the farmers can use that as a collateral to get a loan from the banks. But we are not doing loans ourselves, so maybe World Bank.
So thank you so much. So what we are actually doing now is to support women organizing themselves into VSLA, these community associations, to strengthen savings, but also to have a rotating loans. And then another step that happened in the country is the creation of a women bank institution, which is actually allocating loan to cooperatives, and we are encouraging our women that are in VSLAs to get to the next level of cooperatives so that they can be eligible to those sort of credit. We hope that it could be improving in the coming years.
I don't know if Anu, did you want to comment on that as well?
Oh, yes. Also, I agree with the last speaker, because we also have been working with collectives, strengthening women into collectives. And another thing is for our rural resilience activity, we use a push and pull approach. So while we work on the VSLAs to strengthen their group management skills, their group dynamics, we also try to attract partners, financial service providers. We, speak with them using our data to tell them, listen, you keep working with the men, but women are untapped. There is a segment of the market that are untapped, and they do have money. They spend money. They use money. So we go and we do a lot of marketing around the potentials that women have in terms of being able to access and service these loans. So through these partnerships, we actually mobilize them to go to the communities to try to also provide these financial services in the communities. That helps us to, bridge the gap around, access for women to actually go to the banks. But when the banks go to the communities, it reduces that travel time and tries to at least make it accessible to women and young people who are excluded. And on rural resilience activity, we've been able to mobilize loans at VSLA level, and also from the banks to cooperatives. And we have evidence that women have proven to be more dependable, more reliable when it comes to servicing loans. So these are some evidences we've gathered that we're able to also deploy in, trying to expand. Of course, this is not without its challenges. And like I said, it's incremental. You achieve with this commercial service bank, and then you're trying to see how you can deploy the learnings in another setting. Thank you.
Great, thank you. We're actually at time. I don't know if you have one burning last question, but we're a little bit over time. So, did you have a quick question?
Yeah, just a quick question is is about the fact that in most cases we engage women, we are bringing, interventions to them, but we forget to think about the negative impact of these interventions on them, particularly increasing more labor on these women.
Thank you for that thought. And I'm actually going to ask us to think through some additional things as we have what we call the Failure Festival today about lessons learned. So I'm going to ask us to think through that and bring your thinking to the session a little bit later. Deep appreciation to all of our presenters and our panelists. And I'm going to hand it over to Asli for any last word.
Thank you, Mia. No, I'm just joining Mia in thanking everybody for participating today, and for Elizabeth co-structuring what this session could be or should be like. And yeah, and see you in the next day and a half, continuing this conversation around gender and inclusion.
Thank you. Okay, that was fine.